What if I told you that the only place safe enough to hide from a relentless past is 30,000 feet in the air, inside the lion's den you were never supposed to enter? This is the unbelievable story of a man who commanded an underworld empire with a single glance, only to find his life resting in the hands of a stranger he should have seen as a threat. And the woman fleeing a nightmare who walked through the wrong door and found the one person more dangerous than her pursuers. She was a woman who mastered the art of running. He was a man too feared to ever need to hide. But one desperate mistake is about to change the trajectory of their lives forever. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you'll realize that salvation doesn't always come in a white cape. Sometimes it's clutching a handbag in a seat across from you, waiting for the chance to fight back. You'll understand why our greatest allies often appear when we have the most to lose. This is a story of forensic brilliance, the high-altitude sting of betrayal, and a redemption that forged a bond between two completely different worlds. The rain slicked the asphalt of the private airfield, reflecting the amber glow of the runway lights like a fractured mirror. Nia Caldwell didn't feel the cold. She only felt the frantic, erratic thumping of her heart against her ribs, a rhythm of pure survival. Every shadow stretching behind the hangars looked like Detective Marcos Reed, his cold, methodical gaze finally pinning her down after months of the chase. She gripped the gray-black textured handbag to her chest. The weight of the drive inside felt like a lead anchor, the only proof of the financial rot she had uncovered, and the reason her life was now a forfeit. Ahead, the silhouette of a Gulfstream G650 stood as a silent silver beacon. The engines were already whining, a low-frequency hum that vibrated through the soles of her shoes. She didn't check the tail number. She didn't look for a flight plan. In the logic of the desperate, an open door is the only sanctuary that matters. Nia scrambled up the air stairs, her breath coming in ragged hitches, her professional blazer damp and clinging to her shoulders. The moment her foot hit the plush interior carpet, the hydraulic hiss of the door began. It moved with a finality that made her stomach drop, a heavy, metallic thud that sealed the pressurized cabin from the world outside. For a fleeting second, relief washed over her. She had made it. She was off the ground, leaving the shadow of Reed and the wreckage of her old life on the tarmac. But as she turned to find a seat, the relief vanished, replaced by a cold, paralyzing dread that made the air in her lungs turn to ice. This wasn't a commercial charter. The cabin didn't smell of stale coffee and travel anxiety. It smelled of expensive leather, aged bourbon, and the sharp, acrid tang of clove cigarette smoke. Nia froze. Seated in a deep, dark leather armchair was a man who looked like he had been carved out of the very shadows she was trying to escape. Han Tae-sik didn't look surprised to see her. He sat with a terrifying, controlled calm, one hand resting on a silver watch that caught the cabin's dim light, the other holding a smoldering cigarette. The floral tattoos snaking up his neck and disappearing beneath the collar of his black dress shirt were a silent warning of a world governed by blood and debt, not law. She pressed her hand against her mouth to stifle a cry, her eyes wide as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. She had run from a detective only to walk directly into the private quarters of a man who ruled the city's underworld with an iron fist. The jet began its taxi, the pushback into the dark sky signaling that the point of no return wasn't just a metaphor anymore. She was trapped at 30,000 feet with the Dragon of Soul, and the door was locked tight. The cabin pressure popped in Nia's ears as the Gulfstream climbed sharply into the night, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the suffocating weight of Han Tae-sik's gaze. He didn't move. He simply sat there, a predator watching a stray bird fly directly into its maw, the silver watch on his wrist glinting with every slow, deliberate exhale of smoke. The intricate floral tattoos on his neck seemed to writhe in the dim light, marking him as a man who had survived 1,000 wars that Nia had only ever read about in the terrifying footnotes of her forensic audits. "You have exactly 1 minute to explain how you bypassed my security, or this will be a very short flight for you," Taysik said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that carried the vibration of a threat. He didn't raise his tone, yet the authority in it pinned Nia to her seat more effectively than the seatbelt ever could. Nia gripped her handbag so tightly the texture of the faux leather imprinted on her palms, her knuckles white. I wasn't looking for you," she managed to whisper, her voice trembling as she fought to maintain a shred of professional composure. "I was running. The doors were open. I didn't see the insignia. I just saw an exit." Taysik leaned forward, the light from the cabin hitting the sharp lines of his face and the cold, calculating depth of his eyes. He took a final drag of his cigarette, the cherry glowing bright, before he crushed it out in a crystal tray with a finality that made Nia flinch. "An exit?" he repeated, the corner of his mouth twitching into a mirthless smirk. "You ran from the law to hide with the Mafia. You're either the bravest woman I've ever met or the most foolish." The silence that followed was broken only by the steady, expensive hum of the engines as the jet reached cruising altitude, leveling off at 30,000 feet. The city lights of Seoul were now just a distant, glittering memory beneath the clouds, leaving Nia in a high-altitude vacuum with a man who could erase her with a single phone call. She watched the way he adjusted his black waistcoat, his movements fluid and relaxed, a stark contrast to her own rigid, defensive posture. He wasn't just observing her, he was dissecting her, looking for the lie in her wide eyes and the secret she was clutching against her chest. In this pressurized cage of mahogany and silk, the hierarchy of the world below had vanished. There was no detective, no forensic ledger, and no escape. There was only the smoke, the tattoos, and the terrifying realization that Nia's life was now a coin toss in the hands of a stranger. As the jet banked into a silent curve over the dark expanse of the Pacific, the steady hum of the engines pulled Nia's consciousness back to the rain-drenched streets of Atlanta. In the reflection of the cabin window, she didn't see the plush interior of Taysik's Gulfstream. She saw the sterile, flickering fluorescent lights of the accounting firm where her nightmare had begun. She remembered the exact moment her fingers had frozen over the keyboard, staring at a series of shell company transfers that didn't just represent money, but lives bribes for port inspectors, kickbacks for judges, and a trail of blood leading straight to the city's highest offices. She had thought she was doing the right thing when she made the first copy of those ledgers, but she hadn't accounted for Detective Marcos Reed. Reed wasn't a hero. He was a shark in a tailored suit, a man whose reputation for closing cases was built on a foundation of coerced confessions and evidence that vanished as quickly as the people who stood in his way. Nia remembered the sound of his heavy Oxfords on the pavement outside her apartment, a slow, rhythmic thud that had become the soundtrack to her terror. The memory of their last encounter felt like a physical weight in her chest. Reed had stood in her doorway, his shadow stretching long and menacing across her living room floor, his eyes devoid of any warmth. He hadn't come to arrest her. He had come to reclaim the gray handbag she was currently clutching. "Nia, you're a smart woman," he had whispered, his voice as cold as the steel of his badge. "Smart enough to know that some secrets are too heavy for one person to carry. Give me the bag, and we can forget you ever looked at those files." She had bolted through the fire escape that night, leaving behind her furniture, her photos, and her name. Since then, Reed had been a constant, invisible presence at her back, a shadow that moved through the crowds of every airport and bus station she passed. He was the reason she had stopped trusting the light, the reason she had learned to read the patterns of a tale before she read the time on a clock. Now, as she sat across from a man whose neck was marked with the ink of the underworld, Nia realized the irony of her escape. She had spent months running from a protector of the law who wanted her dead, only to be trapped in the sky with a man who made no pretenses about his darkness. Reed was still out there, likely staring at the very runway she had just departed from, but for the first time, he couldn't reach her. She had traded one shadow for another, but in the cold, calculating eyes of Tae-sik, she saw something Reed had never possessed, a strange, terrifying kind of honesty. The heavy silence of the cabin was punctured by the sound of a curtain sliding open. From the cockpit emerged Yoon Sung-won, Tae-sik's silent enforcer, a man whose presence felt like a sudden drop in cabin pressure. He didn't look at Nia with the predatory curiosity of his boss. He looked at her with the cold, efficiency-driven gaze of a man identifying a malfunction. Without a word of instruction from Tae-sik, Sung-won moved toward Nia, his steps silent, despite the vibration of the jet. Nia's grip on the gray-black handbag tightened until her fingers felt numb, but Sung-won's strength was absolute. With a single, firm motion, he pried the bag from her lap. Nia felt a visceral jolt of exposure, as if he had stripped away her only armor. She watched, paralyzed, as he placed the bag on the mahogany sideboard and began to methodically sift through its contents. Tae-sik watched from his seat, a fresh trail of smoke curling from a new cigarette, his interest sharpening as the enforcer's expression shifted from indifference to a grim, focused intensity. Sung-won pulled out a burner phone, a stack of international currencies, and finally, the heavy, encrypted external drive. He didn't just see a traveler's belongings. He saw the toolkit of a professional. He opened a sleek laptop on the sideboard and connected the drive, his fingers moving with a technical precision that betrayed his role as more than just muscle. A series of data streams began to cascade across the screen complex, interlocking webs of offshore accounts, shell companies, and the specific, damning signatures of the Choi Group's rival syndicates. "She isn't a stray, boss," Sung-won said, his voice a low, gravelly monotone that cut through the hum of the engines. He turned the laptop screen toward Tae-sik. "She's a forensic architect. These are the internal ledgers of the Titan Systems merger, the ones that disappeared last week. She didn't just walk onto this jet by mistake. She's carrying the very evidence that could dismantle our expansion." Tae-sik's relaxed posture vanished. He stood up, his shadow looming large against the cabin wall, his eyes fixed on the cascading numbers. The air in the jet, already thin, suddenly felt non-existent. Nia looked from the tattoos on Tae-sik's neck to the cold steel in Sung-won's eyes, realizing the narrative had shifted. To them, she was no longer a terrified woman running from a detective. She was a high-level threat holding the digital detonator to their empire. The man who ruled with an iron fist had just found a crack in his armor, and it was sitting in the seat across from him. Tae-sik moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator closing in on a cornered kill. He ignored the leather armchair, opting instead to perch on the edge of the mahogany sideboard, his silhouette partially obscuring the scrolling data on the laptop screen. The scent of clove and expensive bourbon felt heavier now, pressing into the small space between them until Nia felt she might choke on it. He reached out, not for her, but for the external drive, rolling the cold metal casing between his fingers as if weighing her soul. "My men are trained to look for wires, for ceramic blades, for poison-tipped rings," Tae-sik said, his voice dropping into a low, intimate register that made the hair on Nia's arms stand up. "They weren't trained to look for a forensic architect carrying a digital guillotine." He leaned closer, the silver watch on his wrist catching the dim cabin light. "Tell me, Nia Caldwell, did Titan Systems send you to bleed me dry before the merger, or are you just a thief with very expensive taste and information?" "I didn't steal it," Nia snapped, the fear finally sparking into a brief hot flash of defiance. She looked him directly in the eye, her hands still trembling but her voice finding a sudden, sharp clarity. "I built it. Those ledgers? I'm the one who traced the routing numbers. I'm the one who found the triple encrypted accounts Reed was using to fund his investigations. I didn't want your secrets, Mr. Han. I wanted my life back." Tae-sik went still. He studied her face, searching for the telltale flicker of a lie, but all he found was the raw, exhausted truth of a woman who had seen too much. He looked back at the screen, where the complex webs of offshore transfers continued their silent dance. He realized then that she wasn't an assassin sent to take his life. She was something far more dangerous to his enemies. She was the one person who could map the invisible veins of the underworld, a woman who knew exactly where every cent was buried and whose hand was on the shovel. Reed isn't just a detective, Taysik murmured, more to himself than to her. He's a scavenger, and you're the map he lost. A slow, dark smile spread across his face, one that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. He didn't see a captive anymore. He saw the ultimate leverage. Sung-won, get her some water, and bring my secure terminal. It seems my unexpected guest has a much higher value than a mere trespasser. We aren't just flying to Seoul anymore, Nia. We're going to war, and you're going to show me exactly where to strike.
The transition from psychological interrogation to physical chaos was instantaneous. A violent jolt rocked the Gulf Stream, sending the crystal whiskey decanter shattering against the mahogany floor. The cabin lights flickered, hummed with a dying frequency, and then plunged into a haunting emergency crimson. The steady, million-dollar purr of the engines transformed into a discordant whine as the jet pitched sharply to the left. Sung-won, report, Taysik commanded, his hand clamping onto the edge of the sideboard to steady himself, his eyes never leaving the flight deck door. Navigation is unresponsive, boss. We're being spoofed from an internal terminal, the enforcer shouted over the sudden roar of wind shear. Nia slid against the tan leather of her seat, her fingers digging into the upholstery. Through the chaos, she saw Evelyn Park, the flight assistant whose presence had been as unremarkable as the air, standing by the galley. She wasn't reaching for a handrail or showing a hint of fear. In the demonic red light, Evelyn's professional mask had evaporated, replaced by the cold, flat stare of a woman completing a transaction. While Taysik and Sung-won turned their attention toward the cockpit to regain control of the plummeting bird, Evelyn moved toward Nia. She didn't reach for a medical kit. She pulled a silenced polymer pistol from a hidden compartment beneath the linen storage. You were never part of the contract, Nia, Evelyn said, her voice eerily calm despite the jet's violent shuddering. The dragon was supposed to go down with his secrets. You're just a loose thread that needs to be burned. Nia realized then that the wrong jet hadn't just been a sanctuary for her, it was a tomb being prepared for Taysik. The betrayal wasn't coming from the ground. It was already in the sky. Evelyn raised the weapon, her eyes fixed on the gray handbag Nia still held like a shield. She didn't just want Nia dead. She wanted the drive. A second wave of turbulence threw the cabin into a vertical dive. The sudden weightlessness sent Evelyn into the ceiling, her shot splintering the window frame just inches from Nia's head. Panic surged through Nia, but beneath it, the forensic architect began to calculate. She looked at the laptop Seung-won had left open on the sideboard, the code still scrolling. The jet wasn't falling because of a mechanical failure. It was being hacked. Evelyn scrambled to her feet, her face contorted with the urgency of a failing mission. Taysik, realizing the true nature of the turbulence, lunged across the tilting floor, his hand reaching for the woman who had served his tea for years. But Nia didn't wait for the Mafia boss to save her. She lunged for the laptop, her fingers flying over the keys as the jet began to scream in its descent. If she didn't close the back door now, the past she was running from wouldn't matter, they'd all be shadows in the Pacific. The scream of the jet's engines was a physical wall of sound, but inside Nia's mind, the noise was suddenly replaced by the familiar, binary silence of a high-stakes audit. The fear that had paralyzed her moments ago hadn't vanished. It had simply been compressed into a singular, razor-sharp focus. As Evelyn lunged toward her again, Nia ignored the threat of the weapon, her hands finding the mechanical keys of the laptop with the instinctive memory of a concert pianist. "Sung-won!" "Keep her off me!" Nia shouted, her voice cutting through the roar of the depressurizing cabin. She didn't look up to see the enforcer's response. Her eyes were locked on the terminal, watching the cascade of malicious code that was rewriting the Gulfstream's flight laws. The attack was elegant, a recursive loop designed to override the fly-by-wire system and force a nosedive that no pilot could pull out of. It was the same digital signature she had seen in the Titan system's shell accounts, the same ghost protocol used to move millions across the globe without a trace. Nia realized then that the hack wasn't just a murder attempt, it was a cleanup operation. By crashing the plane, the syndicate wouldn't just kill Tae-sik, they would incinerate the physical drive and the only woman who knew how to read it. Her fingers flew, a blur of motion as she began to deconstruct the exploit's architecture. She wasn't just defending, she was counter-auditing. She identified the packet headers, tracing the origin of the signal not to a ground station, but to a local device within the cabin. "It's a proximity bridge," she muttered, her breath hitching as the floor tilted another 5 degrees. "She's using the galley's smart hub to relay the override." Tae-sik was a shadow in the periphery. His hand clamped on Evelyn's wrist, the two of them locked in a silent, brutal struggle for the polymer pistol. But Nia knew the physical fight was a secondary front. If she didn't sever the bridge, they would be dead before the gun even fired. She initiated a forced kernel reset, injecting a series of corrupted data packets into the loop, a forensic poison designed to bloat the attacker's buffer until the system crashed. "Hold the nose up!" Nia screamed, hitting the final enter key with a force that rattled the chassis. The jet shuddered, a violent, bone-jarring vibration that felt like the aircraft was being torn in two. Then, the screaming whine of the engines subsided into a steady, powerful thrum. The artificial horizon on the dashboard flickered, reset, and leveled out. The terrifying descent halted, the G-force pinning Nia into her seat as the jet reclaimed the sky. She sat back, her chest heaving, the laptop screen now displaying a steady emerald green. She had stopped the crash, but in doing so, she had done the one thing she had spent months trying to avoid. She had made herself the most visible person in the world. Nia looked up, meeting Tae-sik's stunned, blood-flecked gaze, and realized that her days of running were over. She was no longer just a witness, she was the weapon. The stabilization of the aircraft provided only a heartbeat of relief before the cabin erupted into a new, more intimate violence. Evelyn, realizing her digital assassination had failed, pivoted with the desperation of a cornered animal. She wrenched her arm free from Tae-sik's grip, the polymer pistol swinging wildly in the red-drenched cabin. A shot whined through the air, shattering a crystal bulkhead near the cockpit, the spray of glass slicing through the high-altitude silence. "Sung-won, take the flight deck. Secure the pilots." Tae-sik roared, his voice thick with the unfiltered authority of a man who had reclaimed his domain. The enforcer disappeared behind the curtain, leaving Tae-sik alone in the main cabin with the traitor and the witness. Nia watched as Tae-sik closed the distance between himself and Evelyn. There was no hesitation in his stride, despite the weapon pointed at his chest. He moved with a terrifying, singular purpose. His black shirt damp with sweat, the tattoos on his neck stark against his pale skin. He wasn't just fighting for his life anymore. He was shielding the mahogany desk where Nia sat shielding the woman who had just breathed life back into his dying jet. "You're a long way from a paycheck." "Evelyn," Tae-sik hissed, his hand snapping out like a viper to catch the barrel of the gun. A muffled thud echoed as the weapon discharged into the floorboards, but Tae-sik didn't flinch. He used his weight to pin Evelyn against the galley wall, his forearm pressing against her throat. For a second, Nia saw the dragon in full view, the cold, merciless shadow that ruled Seoul. But then, his eyes flickered toward her. It wasn't a look of suspicion, but a silent, desperate command to keep moving, to keep working. Nia realized then that the hierarchy had collapsed entirely. She was no longer his prisoner. and he was no longer her captor. They were two souls, tethered by a single line of code and a shared enemy. She didn't wait for the struggle to end. She turned back to her laptop, her fingers flying to build a digital firewall around the jet's communication array. "They're still trying to ping us," Nia shouted over the sound of the struggle. "Titan is trying to initiate a secondary wipe. Tasik, I need the biometric bypass on your watch. Now." Without breaking his hold on the struggling traitor, Tasik slammed his silver watch against the sensor pad on the sideboard. The connection sparked green. He was trusting her with the literal keys to his life, handing a stranger the power to delete him or save him. In that moment of absolute chaos, the man who had never looked down and the woman who had always run found a singular, terrifying point of trust. As Sungwon emerged from the cockpit with a nod of control, Tae-sik looked at Nia through the drifting smoke and the dim red light, and for the first time, he didn't see a maid or a witness. He saw his equal. The descent into Seoul was a gradual return to a world that no longer made sense. As the Gulf Stream pierced the lower cloud deck, the morning sun finally broke across the horizon, painting the cabin in a brilliant, forgiving gold that made the night's crimson emergency lights feel like a fever dream. Nia sat back in the tan leather seat, her gray handbag resting loosely in her lap. The drive was still inside, but its weight had changed. It was no longer a burden of fear, but a contract of power. The jet touched down with a gentle, sophisticated kiss of rubber against tarmac. As they taxied toward a private hangar far removed from the public terminals, Nia saw the flashing blue lights of the police escort. At the center of the formation stood Detective Marcos Reed. Even from the window, his posture was unmistakable, rigid, expectant, and hungry. He thought the flight was a prison transport. He thought he was finally going to reclaim his secrets from the wreckage of a broken woman. Tae-sik stood, adjusting his black waistcoat and smoothing the unbuttoned collar of his shirt. He looked at Nia, then reached down, offering his hand. It wasn't the gesture of a captor, but of a partner. "Stay close," he murmured, his voice now a steady hum of protection. "The shadow he's looking for doesn't exist anymore." The air stairs hissed open, and the cold morning air rushed in, smelling of jet fuel and rain. Nia stepped out onto the platform, her heart racing, but her head held high. Reed stepped forward, his hand already reaching for his pocketed cuffs. "Nia Caldwell," he barked, his voice echoing under the hangar's steel rafters. "You're under arrest for the theft of government property and—" "Detective," Tae-sik interrupted, stepping into the light, his presence effectively eclipsing Nia. He didn't shout, he simply let the gravity of his name do the work. "You seem to be mistaken. Miss Caldwell is the chief financial auditor for my international merger. She has spent the last 12 hours on a secure flight, under my personal protection, documenting the attempted sabotage of my fleet by your associates at Titan Systems." Reed froze, his face contorting into a mask of pure, frustrated rage. He looked at Nia, then at the wall of black-suited men standing behind Tae-sik. He knew the math. In a world of ledgers and leverage, Tae-sik had just rewritten Nia's history in ink that Reed couldn't erase. To touch her now was to declare war on an empire that the law couldn't touch. Tae-sik leaned in, his voice a lethal whisper intended only for the detective. "The files are already distributed to 3 different continents, Reed. If you ever breathe her name again, the world will see exactly what's in that handbag." Without another word, Tae-sik led Nia toward a waiting black sedan. As the door closed, shielding them from the cameras and the shadows of the past, Nia looked at the man beside her. They were leaving the old world behind the violence, the running, and the secrets. As the car sped away into the waking city, the dragon and the architect looked toward the horizon, ready to build an empire where they finally owned the light.